Well, my name is Larry Schaefer. I'm Vice President of the Board of Directors of the Rhone Rangers. I'm also a proud member of the Santa Barbara County wine community. And I want to welcome everyone to a Zoom that's featuring wines from Santa Barbara County. For those of you who don't know, wines have been made in Santa Barbara County. Rhone wines have been made in Santa Barbara County for over 4 decades. But we're not necessarily known as a region that produces Rhone varieties, much less known than regions north of us. So it's fun to put the spotlight on our region. We've got some great winemakers here to talk about their wines and their philosophies. And I'm going to start by introducing Allison Levine from Please the Palate. I am honored to call Allison a personal friend as well as a colleague. She is well known in the wine industry as a writer and a speaker, not only on wines from the US, but actually internationally as well. So I'm going to sit back. I want to let everyone know that we'll be following the chat both on Facebook Live and on Zoom. So if you have questions as we're going, please feel free to put them into the chat and I'll make sure that the panelists get asked those questions. Allison, it's all you.
Thank you. Well, I want to welcome everyone to the Rhone Rangers Santa Barbara event. I'm really excited to be here with you all today as we focus on a region that's really near and dear to my heart. I'm based in Los Angeles, and I consider Santa Barbara wine country to be in my backyard. It is technically, 2 hours away. And I was first introduced to the region when I was a student at UCSB. We would go wine tasting on weekends, but of course, this is when I knew absolutely nothing about wine. And so now I've been in the wine industry for more than 2 decades, and I've run a wine education business. I've sold wine for an importer distributor. I've worked for a wine critic organizing trade events. And then I started my own business, Please the Palate, 12 years ago. Well, it'll be 12 years. We're 1 month shy of that. I work with wine regions around the world to organize trade events around the US. And as Larry said, I'm a freelance writer. I also host a podcast. I'm the US host for a podcast called Wine Soundtrack, where you get to know winemakers in 30 questions. A couple of the winemakers here today have been on that podcast already. I co-host a wine education video series on YouTube called Crush on This. And I also co-host monthly virtual events with boutique wineries in the Central Coast, of which I've worked with a couple of the people on this chat. So I've had the privilege to taste wines from around the world and always love discovering new wines. But I always find myself coming back to Santa Barbara County, the San Ynez Valley. It's the quality of the wines, the personalities of the winemakers, the beauty and diversity of the valley. And that's why we're here today. I'm also sure that if you're here today, you have an affinity for Rhone grape varieties, or maybe you're hoping to learn more about them. And as Larry said, I know some of you are on Zoom and some on Facebook Live, so feel free to send questions in the chat, and Larry and I'll also try to jump in and we'll try to include them along the way. So before we get started, I think the most important thing is to reiterate something you may have heard before, but you can never hear it enough. We can never repeat the uniqueness and specialness of Santa Barbara wine country because it's home to the only transverse mountain range in North America. And what that means is that the mountains run east to west and not north to south. So the valley opens up directly to the Pacific Ocean, and that allows the fog and ocean breeze to travel down the valley. And for every mile you travel down the valley, it gets a degree warmer. So you're talking about from the western side, at one temperature and 15 miles down the valley, it'll be 15 degrees warmer. And that's why so many grape varieties do well in this region. Now, many people are very quick to think about Santa Barbara as Pinot and Chard country, and that's likely due to that little movie a couple of decades ago. It is true that the western side of the San Ynez Valley in the Santa Rita Hills and in the Santa Maria Valley are where Pinot Noir and Chardonnay thrive. But Rhone grapes also thrive there. And then if you move a little more east in the middle of the valley in Ballard Canyon and Los Olivos district, they're dominated by Rhone varieties. And the fact is that Rhone grapes thrive across the valley in all 7 appellations of Santa Barbara wine country. That's Happy Canyon, Santa Maria Valley, San Ynez Valley, Ballard Canyon, Los Olivos district, Santa Rita Hills, and Elisa's Canyon. So Rhone is really what thrives in the valley, and we're joined by 4 winemakers today, each with a different grape variety from the Rhone Valley, from different parts of the valley. And we're going to start with none other than Bob Lindquist, who really doesn't need an introduction. He is a winemaking pioneer of the Central Coast. He started at Zaca Mesa in 1979 and then created Coupe in 1982. Now, Bob is often known as the king of the Rhone in Santa Barbara County, and that's because of the very significant markers he's made along the way. He was the first person to make Syrah in Santa Barbara County in 1982. He was the first to produce single varietal Marsanne made in California in 1987. He was the first person to make cool climate Bien Nacido Syrah in 1987, the first to make a red Rhone blend in Santa Barbara in 1988, and the first to make Viognier in Santa Barbara in 1989. And after 36 years with Coupe, he left in 2018 and launched Lindquist Family Wines in 2019. So Bob, tell us what it is about Santa Barbara wine country that you think is ideal for Rhone varieties and where your passion for Rhone varieties comes from.
Well, it harkens back to my early days at Zaca Mesa. We had a crew of winemakers and wine staff there that were really into wines from all over the world. Ken Brown was the winemaker, Jim Clendenin was the assistant winemaker, Adam Tolmack was the enologist, and myself. So the four of us were all what I would call wine geeks. And we like to drink Bordeaux, we like to drink Burgundy, and we like to drink wines from the Rhone and from Piedmont and et cetera, et cetera. And we had planted some Petite Syrah at Zaca Mesa it was either 78 or 79, because Zaca Mesa was making a red blend that they called Toyon Noir, and they thought Petite Syrah would be the ideal blender for that variety. Concurrently with that, Gary Eberly was making Syrah, real Syrah, up in Paso Robles, and Gary was a friend of ours as well. And we kind of all got together and said, hey, we shouldn't be growing Petite Syrah, we should be growing Syrah instead. So the Syrah vines were grafted over. I believe it was 1980 when they were grafted over. And then the first crop of Syrah came off those vines in 1983, which was actually the first Syrah, true Syrah, that was grown and produced in Santa Barbara County. When you mentioned that I was the first to make Syrah in Santa Barbara County, I was, but it was from Paso Robles grapes that I bought from Gary Eberly. What attracted me to the area was the beauty of the area, kind of the newness of the area, the fact that we could be kind of pioneers of a region, and then also the climate. It was so unique with the transverse mountains and valleys that you mentioned, and we also have kind of a dry climate here, so we have a really long, cool growing season. With some of our best weather in September and October, which is great for the later ripening varieties like Syrah, like Roussanne, like Grenache. Marsanne kind of falls in the middle, but yeah, so that's what brought me to the area. It was a job that brought me to the area, but I stayed. I'd fallen in love with the area, looked for a job here, found a job here, and then stayed based on how much I loved it.
Well, so now I know that you had started in Santa Maria Valley and you were doing cool climate Syrah and other grapes, and now you're sourcing fruit from across the Central Valley. I know you have two different Marsanne bottlings. I had the pleasure of having your Edna Valley one last week, and now we've got your San Ynez Valley one today. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the different areas of Santa Barbara County and how Rhone grapes, in your opinion, kind of thrive across the region from the cooler climate to the warmer.
Well, sure. Because of the long growing season, they actually do well in kind of all the different microclimates of the Central Coast. You had said Central Valley. I just wanted to.
Yeah, sorry.
I know you didn't mean that, but just wanted to clarify.
It's a combination of San Ynez Valley and Central Coast.
No, I get it. And I also work with grapes from southern San Luis Obispo County, which interestingly enough shares a lot of the same climatic conditions with Santa Barbara County. And in fact, back in the early 90s, there was a movement by some of the big Napa wineries to create a new AVA that included southern San Luis Obispo County and Santa Barbara County that they were going to call the Santa Barbara Coast. And it got shot down because Paso Robles wasn't included in the Santa Barbara Coast, and rightly so. But anyways, I diverge a little bit, but because of the long growing season, we can grow Syrah at Daugherty vineyard, the very, western edge of they're even west of the Santa Rita Hills, or you can grow it in Happy Canyon and it makes great wine, or you can grow it kind of in what the Ballard Canyon folks would say would be the perfect spot to grow Syrah, which is kind of right in the middle in the Ballard Canyon AVA. And I find the same is true in areas like the Santa Maria Valley. You can grow great Syrah, at Solomon Hills, which is way on the west end, or at Rancho Sisquoc, which is way on the east end, or kind of for me, the prime spot, Villa Macedo, which is kind of right in the middle of those two areas. So.
And so let's talk about this Marsanne. You have it, as I said, from San Ynez Valley. It's from
Yep, I'm going to pour myself some.
From the Ibarra-Young Vineyard in the Los Olivos district. And can you talk a little, tell everyone a little history of the vineyard, but also the Los Olivos district specifically. It borders up against Ballard Canyon to the east of it.
Right, and kind of Happy Canyon to the, Happy Canyon would be on the east, Ballard Canyon on the west. It's kind of the what I would call the heart of the Santa Ynez Valley region, the area that Los Olivos is in, and Santa Ynez and Ballard, not to be confused with Ballard Canyon, the little township of Ballard. So it's right in the heart. It goes all the way to the Santa Ynez River, which makes it a pretty big growing area. Mm-hmm. And the Ibarra-Young Vineyard is right in the middle of that Los Olivos district area. It's a vineyard that was first planted in 1971. Gets its name from Charlotte Young, who was the owner of the property, and Miguel Ibarra, who was her ranch foreman. The two of them planted the vineyard in 1971, which is over 50 years ago now when you think about it. Cabernet Sauvignon on its own roots. And in 1986, I began leasing the vineyard and grafted it over to Rhone varieties, including this Marsanne. I got the budwood from Randall Graham at Bonnie Doon. He had some Marsanne planted, and he had actually made Marsanne before I did, but he never bottled it as a varietal. He made it into a blend that he called Les Sophistes, a blend with Marsanne and Roussanne. Turned out that the Roussanne was actually Viognier, but that's a whole different story. But anyways, when I made my first Marsanne in 1987, as far as I know, it was the first one made in California that was labeled as such.
So this vineyard is farmed organically?
It is since 1999. And I should mention that I leased it from 1986 until 2018 when Cupé was sold. And then in 2019, it was kind of managed by somebody else who didn't do a great job. And I passed on getting any grapes from the vineyard that year. And then in 2020, a young winemaker, a woman named Alice Anderson, took over the lease, and she and her partner, Christopher DeFelice, started farming it then and continued to practice organic methods as well as regenerative and biodynamic practices, bringing animals onto the vineyard and doing all the work themselves. They really have done a great job. And so in 2020, I started buying grapes from Alice, a little bit of Syrah and a little bit of this Marsanne.
And so tell us a little bit about Marsanne, and especially as a single varietal wine. It's not something we see as often as blended with Roussanne.
That's true, yeah. In the Northern Rhone, you'll often find Marsanne by itself, and very much often blended with a little bit of Roussanne, but it's those two varieties are the dominant white grape varieties of the Northern Rhone. The appellations, Hermitage, San Joseph, Crozes Hermitage, Saint-Péray. And they make wines, depending on where Marsanne is grown in the Northern Rhone, it can make a wine that's light and fresh, like this wine is, or it can make a wine that's really heavy, rich, and ample, something like a Chave white Hermitage that, that's just a real, it's not a hit you over the head wine, but it's a real rich example of what Marsanne can be.
This is just such a beautiful wine. It's got beautiful acidity, this like little hint of minerality, that really delicate texture.
Yeah, I tend to pick this on the early side. Marsanne is a variety that loses its acidity pretty quickly as it ripens, and the pH tends to climb pretty quickly as it ripens. So I like to pick it fairly low in sugar, usually around 20 or 21 bricks. And this 21 vintage was picked at about 20.4. And, so it's relatively moderate in alcohol, but it still has nice freshness and acidity. And one of the cool things about Marsanne is how well it ages. That's something you wouldn't necessarily think of in a light white wine. But I guarantee if you have a good cellar, you could put this down for 20 years and be greatly rewarded by the way that it ages.
Unfortunately, I'll be finishing this one and not let it age. But I'm curious, does it spend any time in oak? Is it neutral oak, stainless steel?
No, completely fermented in oak barrels, but all neutral barrels. And one of the important things that I find with Marsanne is to remove the juice from the juice lees before going into barrel. I have a kind of a funny little story about that. In 1988, I visited the cellar of Jean-Louis Chave for the first time, and I had just made my second vintage of Marsanne that year. And the wine smelled like canned corn, the one that I made. And the first one didn't. In 1987, the very first one I made turned out just fine for whatever reason. I think it was just luck. But in 88, the wine smelled a lot like canned corn, and I had made the wine kind of like I do Chardonnay, giving it lees contact, kind of putting all the lees in the barrel, with the juice. And Gerard Chave, who was the winemaker, the current John Louis' father, Gerard was the winemaker at that time. He said, "Oh, with Marsanne, you must separate it from the lees before putting it in barrel." And it was an important lesson. And so that's what we do. We settle it for 48 hours in stainless steel tank, chilling it, settling it, and then racking it clearly off the juice lees into neutral barrels for fermentation. It also goes through a secondary malolactic fermentation in barrel, and then kept in barrel without any racking, just keeping it kind of reductive in style until we get ready to bottle it. This was about 9 months in barrel.
So Chris Kern wanted to know why Marsanne has not caught on as much as a single varietal wine like Viognier has or Grenache Blanc. It's often used as a blending grape. So why does this not stand on its own more often?
Well, it does in the Rhone. It just doesn't here. I like to say about Marsanne, and I say it about Roussanne too, is we gain Marsanne customers one at a time. And hopefully, we're gaining at least one more tonight.
There was another question, which was, what vineyard was the Randall Graham Marsanne grape buds from?
From Bonnie Doon. So this was Randall's original Bonnie Doon vineyard up in the hills, above Santa Cruz, that he lost to Pierce's disease, maybe 3 or 4 years after this. And he had gotten the budwood from the UC Davis test block.
Okay.
Yeah.
I understand that we're on Marsanne, but one quick question going back is Tom Hill wanted to know where Olmos cuttings for Gary Eberle's originally came from in France. Do you know?
According to Gary, they came from Chapoutier in Hermitage.
Great.
And there's nobody ever had a different story other than that. So I'm sticking with that because that's Gary's story.
Sounds good. So back to the Marsanne, what would you pair food-wise with this Marsanne?
Well, it goes great with lighter, dishes, seafood type dishes. Something like grilled shrimp, it would go really well with. It has enough acidity to handle something like that. Hard cheeses, when it's aged, and I did mention how well it ages. When it's an aged wine, it's a great wine to have with a nice cheese plate. Works really well with that. So anything kind of along those lines.
So I have one final question for you before we move on, and that's if you were to pair your wine with music, what song, musician, or style would this Marsanne be? Well,
I was ready for you on this one.
I know. When I had you on my podcast and asked a question simply.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of a Beatles, Beach Boys, Kinks fanatic. Originally I was going to go with Here, There, and Everywhere, but then I settled on I Just Wasn't Made for These Times by the Beach Boys, because Marsanne hasn't found its time yet. And if you give it time, it'll reward you greatly.
Fantastic. Last question. I actually do have one more. What is the retail price on this wine?
Would be about $35. or $38. Sorry, it was 35, but we raised it to 38 because it's so rare.
And you can find the wines at LindquistFamilyWines.com.
Correct.
Yes. So thanks, Bob, and feel free to jump in any time during this, but we're going to move on to Robert Daugherty now from Margerum Wine Company with our second white wine, which is the Viognier. It's the Margerum Estate Viognier, Los Olivos district. That is a 2022. So Robert is his understanding and wine making developed at a young age, working alongside his aunt and uncle, who are very legendary winemakers in the area, Diana and Rick Longoria. Robert worked 3 harvests in New Zealand, then spent 4 years with Dierberg and Starlane before going to Wink, which is a large producer of wine. And he is a new addition to Margerum, having joined just about 4 months ago. So, Robert, I know you've been in Santa Barbara County now for a little while when you came back to Dierberg, but what is it that made you return to Santa Barbara wine country?
Well, I'm actually a native of Tucson, Arizona. So I spent my summers as a kid going to meet my dad's family out here in Santa Barbara County. You know, empty landscape. Every time I came to Santa Barbara County, I was just amazed at flowers and fruit and, you know, the familial tie in going to the vineyard, going to the winery to work alongside Rick and Diana. I just was fascinated at a place where things grow, and my opportunity to get involved in that with my family is something that I could not pass up. So my first opportunity I could after I graduated college, I worked for the military and was stationed abroad for a bit. But Rick said, "Hey, I need help, and I know you like coming here as a kid. You want to come back?" And I came back and really never left. I always knew that this is where my life would be as a very young child. I knew that I love the desert, but I love Santa Barbara County even more.
Wow. So now you've worked obviously with a number of different grapes, having worked with Dierberg and Starlane and then Wink, and obviously with your aunt and uncle. I know that Margerum has an 18-acre estate planted exclusively to Rhone grape varieties, but you also source from other vineyards and work with other grape varieties. So what draws you to Rhone grapes?
Well, I've got to harken back to, you know, my time at Longoria. Rick, some of you on this call might remember his Olivos vineyard Syrah, which I think was one of the best examples of Syrah in the area. And my very first vintage, we were sourcing from that vineyard. And I remember that wine in particular, just absolutely speaking to me, and just listening to Rick talk about it. And Rick was, you know, a specialist in Burgundian style. And for him to make a departure and say, like, I love Syrah as well, was like a statement that always resonated with me. So I've worked with those Rhone varietals on and off, but when Doug Margerum was looking for a new winemaker, and you know, I knew that he was predominantly a Syrah producer, I had to hop on it, because since my very first harvest with my uncle, I knew that Syrah was the grape that I wanted to spend most of my career on.
Wow. Well, Syrah,
I got to add one more thing. Sorry,
yeah,
much to Rick's chagrin, Rick Longoria's chagrin. So.
Syrah is the grape that winemakers love, and that's the one everyone wants to know why it won't take off in the market. But we're not doing Syrah with you today. We're doing Viognier. So this is from your estate in the Los Olivos district.
It is.
Tell us about the estate vineyard. How old are the vines? What's the soil makeup?
So the vineyards were actually originally planted to Italian varietals, and I don't know the exact date of the planting, but I do know that in 2018, we actually grafted the entire vineyard over to Rhone varietals. So we have all major 5 Rhone reds and all major 5 Rhone whites planted at the estate. It is in the Los Olivos district. So, you know, warm days, cool nights, every once in a while you get the residual fog in the morning, which is great. The soil is usually, it's mainly like clay loam, alluvial. There's some river rock there as well, ancient riverbed. The Viognier is actually planted on the lowest part of the vineyard, so you get a lot of cool air that settles there, and it helps to elongate the ripening process for the Viognier, which is great. It is about 1.4 acres. A very small amount of it goes to this bottling that we're tasting here today. It's a very special bottling. The remainder of the wine actually goes to our M5 white blend, which is all 5 white varietals from the Rhone region, which is a great wine to try as well. But the estate vineyard is just a beautiful expression of the Rhone varietals, and as Bob was saying earlier, a great middling area in the region for the Rhone varietals. I think you get a combination of some warmer climate characteristics, some cooler climate characteristics, which then makes you have just a cross section of really the entire flavor profile that Rhone wines can offer you.
Yeah, absolutely. So about this Viognier, Viognier always has such beautiful aromatics, but can get a little weighty on the palate or lack acidity. And this one has a lot of freshness. It's got texture, but it's also bright. Are you picking early? What's your process in making the wine? What are you doing with this?
I'm glad that you say that. And one of the reasons I really enjoy Doug Margerum is him and I's palates are pretty well aligned. I think him and I both agree that Viognier can be a little too aromatic sometimes, right? A little too expressive, too flowery. And it can be too oily. So in the winemaking process, we're actually leaning away from that a little bit. We are picking what we think is physiologically ripe, but also, good natural acidity. So there's that intersection of proper acidity and proper ripeness that we think we're hitting right on. And like Bob was saying, maybe we're picking a little on the leaner side than your average producer, but I think that this wine benefits from that. And we carry that through the through the winery. So we are fermenting 100% in stainless steel. We are fermenting it very cold to preserve fruit aromas. And we're actually aging in stainless steel barrels at all. So this is not seeing any new oak at all. It's supposed to be a pure expression of the grape from our vineyard that is not influenced by oak or really encouraging any of that oily fatness that you get from your traditional Viognier in California. It never perceives hot. Viognier to me has this striking ability to balance roundness and acidity. It does retain acidity relatively well. And I don't think a lot of white grapes can accomplish that roundness and acidity at the same time. You sacrifice one for the other, but this wine, I believe, expresses that.
Yeah, I think that, you get a little bit of that, a touch of that kind of viscosity or oiliness, but not in the extreme. That just gives it a kind of softness on it, but that delicate acidity just kind of washes over it all. And it's really refreshing because, Viognier is usually one of those grapes, like we were saying. This isn't so enjoyable to drink. So tell me, what would you pair with this Viognier?
Well, generally I've always had Viogniers of this style with I'd say like a fish or shellfish. It also will do really well with Thai food, Japanese sushi as well. Like I think that those types, goat cheese is pairing with this wine.
So it can match with a little bit of acidity, or even give it something a little, like a little light kind of, I would think even like a Beurre Blanc of some sort, and it could wash right over it.
I personally love to drink all wines standalone, but the market has always said that Viognier is a food wine. I don't 100% agree with that, but because I think it's great on its own. But yeah, it typically is a food wine, and all those foods will pair very nicely.
Fantastic. And I got to ask you, if you were to pair this wine with music, what song, music, or style would it be?
Wow. For those of you watching, we did get prepped for this question, so I did have time to think about it. I'm not sure if I just spoiled that. But I have to go with REM's Night Swimming is what I have to go with, if you've all heard that song. There is a poetic nature to the storied history of Viognier. And I think that song is very poetic and beautiful, just like the grape, and maybe misunderstood, just as the song can be.
Bob, what was your comment about the song?
Oh, it's a great song. Yeah.
So Robert, I have a question for you. Tom Hill wanted to know, and you may not know the answer specific to this, but do you know how Doug Margerum saw the light with Rhones? Because when he owned the Wine Cask restaurant, that was not his focus.
You know, I don't want to answer that question on his behalf. So I can only take guesses at it. So that will, I can make something up if you'd like.
No, just something to delve into maybe for next time.
But no, I don't know. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Sorry, I can answer that.
Fantastic. I know your connection is dropping in and out a little bit, but hope you can hear us okay.
I can hear you fine.
Oh, there, you're back. Now your lips are moving with you.
Cool.
Well, I think then we will move on to red wine, and with Mike Brughelli of Folded Hills Wine. And Robert, stay on. We'll come back for some questions and discussion. But Michael has worked in most facets of the wine industry. He spent 7 years as director of grape sales for Miller family, owners of Bienesito and Solomon Hills Vineyards. He left in 2019 to start his own consulting firm, Vineyard, and in 2020 sold his half of the critically beloved brand Scar of the Sea to launch a new eponymous label for high-end Pinot Noir and Chardonnay grown in the Santa Maria Valley. And then in 2020, Mike joined Folded Hills as the consulting winemaker. So, Mike, as a California native, what drew you to Santa Barbara wine country?
That's a great question. Kind of like Bob, I mean, a job is first what drew me there. I first had the opportunity, the tremendous opportunity to work with Ken Volk, who had sold Wild Horse and started a new winery at the original Byron location just down the road from Bienesito. And so that was an incredible opportunity for me to work with Ken and really fell in love with the region from that moment forward. Folded Hills is an incredible vineyard site. It's the southernmost vineyard in the San Ynez Valley AVA, as you can see from this map. And again, it's cooled by the ocean breezes. It's 4 miles from the ocean as the crow flies, as depicted from this photo, looking from the Gaviota Pass, seeing that wind flow northward. There's also an effect where the wind kind of goes through Santa Rita Hills and flows south. And so we have an interesting cooling effect depending on what's going on at any point in time. About 15 acres of estate vineyard where the cursor is now. There's a few whites planted. That's what we call a creekside vineyard. There's Claret Blanche there, and Marsanne and Grenache Blanc, and then Syrah and Grenache planted up the hillside across the street near the cursor now. And so I got a little derailed by the maps, Allison, but really it's
That's okay. That's okay. I was going to ask you about that anyway, because I know that Folded Hills is the very first winery you will find when you're driving up the 101. And it is a pretty amazing place. I was just there last week, and you really do feel the wind blowing from different directions. And so, as you were saying, like if it stops in one way, it'll come in another way, which is.
And the soils are very fascinating as well. Sandy loams with a touch of dolomitic limestone. And so it's a phenomenal place for these Rhone varieties. And I find that they remind me from this side a little bit more, they seem to be a bit more northern Rhone reminiscent than southern. Very bright flavors, bright fruit components, great acidity. And so it's a pleasure to work with that site.
So I know that the vineyard is farmed organically and biodynamically. I'm curious, I know when we first met, you were working at Bienesito. So, and you spent a lot of your time in the Santa Maria Valley and really cool climate. You talked about, you get that coolness here. But what is it about Rhone grapes that you're loving? Because, I know you originally as a Pinot, Chard, and Syrah guy.
Yeah, I've made Rhone since almost the start of my career. With Ken, we made Syrah, and our running joke with Ken was that he never met a grape he didn't like. So we made a lot of different varieties. But no, in all seriousness, I mean, I'm very, very proud of the Rhones we made with Ken, and that was back in 2006. And then with Scar of the Sea, the Millers who owned Bienesito were gracious enough to allow me to have my own winery while I worked for them. And so built Scar of the Sea with Mikey Juni, which was a wonderful opportunity. And we made Syrah from Santa Cruz Mountains there as well. 100% whole cluster Syrah. And so I've always had an itch for the Rhone varieties. I've always been intrigued by the benchmark wines of the world, and Rhones are certainly have made their impact in those categories as well. And so it truly is a joy to work with these varieties on this site because they naturally want to be something that I believe is pretty special.
And so today we have the 2020 Estate Grenache. This was your first vintage at the winery. Can you tell us a little bit about Grenache and specifically from this vineyard, working with it as opposed to anywhere else you've worked with it?
Absolutely. Grenache is an interesting thing from my perspective in California. I feel like some of the older genetic material we had in the 90s maybe wasn't as optimal. And then pioneers such as Bob certainly helped shepherd better material, and also folks like John Albin. And now we have what I think are very, very good renditions of high quality red Grenache vines. The Grenache at Folded Hills, it tends to have a long growing season. It tends to bud out relatively early, and then it's not picked until middle of October. And to also come back to farming, you mentioned organic and biodynamic. We are certified organic, farming organic completely and have from day one. Biodynamics get applied as much as we can. We're not certified biodynamic. I hope to get there at some point, but currently certified organic and practicing biodynamics as much as possible. And the big intention on that site is really to farm to a level where once the grapes are picked, not much more interaction needs to happen at the winery. In other words, tannins aren't needed to be added, and acids and other enzymes and other things. And so we employ native fermentations in the cellar on the Grenache, and then native secondary fermentation as well. So the whole hope that I have with working with these grapes is always to only need to add sulfur and really nothing else.
A neutral oak?
So on the estate Grenache, there's actually about 20% new oak.
Okay. I mean, it's such a beautiful, bright color, almost translucent in a way. Really, really pretty fruit aromas, this nice kind of mineral. You can almost smell the wind that blows through there, if that makes sense. That sort of minerality and cleanness to it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We tend to get bright red fruit components, bright red cherry, pomegranate, sometimes a dusty chaparral and some sandalwood in that Grenache. But that dusty pomegranate, dusty chaparral seems to be a signature of that site on Grenache.
It leads to these kind of really like dusty tannins, a really juicy finish. So what would you pair this food-wise?
So this tends to go, I had it the other night with a rack of lamb and it was phenomenal. Roasted meats work very well with this Grenache, roasted chicken. I also had it both at Christmas and Thanksgiving with turkey this last year. And I feel like these Grenaches work very well with those dishes as well.
Fantastic. So final question for you. If you were to pair this wine with music, what song, musician, or style would it be?
Last year I went down a pretty deep rabbit hole in this one, so I'm going to try to keep it a little more simple this time. But I do believe that these wines resonate with a particular kind of building in the palate and a crescendo. And I tend to think of classical piano when I think of these wines from Folded Hills. And so, again, I won't get as precise as I did last year, but classical piano composers, I think, tend to tie in with that same theme.
I think I can just hear it in my head because there is such a beauty and elegance to the wine that absolutely. Well, thank you. Dusty, you ready?
Sure.
Okay. Well, we're going to move on to our fourth wine. I'm sorry. Let me back up. Michael, the price on this wine.
Excuse me. This is the 2020 vintage Grant Grenache was $48 and the estate Grenache was $72. And then 2021, there was a small price increase from there.
Okay. And Robert, going back to you, the Viognier, what was the price on that?
36.
36. Okay. I do have questions for you about Viognier and another for Bob, but I want to jump ahead to Dusty and then we'll come back. So our fourth and final wine is from Dusty Nabor of Dusty Nabor Wines. This was a project born out of passion for producing site-specific, terroir-driven California wines. Dusty sources fruit from premier vineyards in Santa Barbara County, including the Santa Rita Hills, Ballard Canyon, Los Olivos District, and his focus is on Syrah, Grenache, Viognier, as well as Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Cabernet Sauvignon. So, Dusty, what drew you to Santa Barbara County?
Logistics, really. My winery is physically located in Camarillo, California. So I'm about 90 miles southeast of Santa Barbara County. But when I first started out in 2015, I began sourcing from a family friend. Our families were friends going back 40 years now, but they were in Paso Robles. And that logistically was very difficult. So I started sourcing a little bit out of Santa Barbara County, out of Ballard Canyon. I started with Syrah, and the Santa Barbara community kind of grabbed a hold of me and brought me in. Like, I had no connections to Paso, I had no connections to Napa, but Santa Barbara, the winemaking community just kind of opened up, and I started to become good friends with Ruben and Matt Dees, the guys that run Kimsey Vineyard. And it just kind of snowballed from there to where now I source throughout the entire valley.
And because you work with different varieties, what is your love for Rhone varieties compared to?
Yeah, I mean, what's the saying? All roads lead to Burgundy. Well, I think that, like, that's true. But there's like this little private back road for the super wine geeks that lead to the Northern Rhone. And I dare say it, that we always joke about it, how the Syrahs do so well with other winemakers, and we're always super excited to share our Syrahs at wine festivals with other winemakers. And then people come around and the festival opens and everybody gravitates towards the Cabernet Sauvignon. That's just the way it works, I call it a back of the table wine, where you're sharing it with the people behind the tables. But it always, the Northern Rhone, Hermitage, that whole area has always been kind of the holy grail for me. And when making wine, it has definitely become the goal. When I make my Syrahs, making them a certain way and having them perform a certain way is always at the top of my list. The other wines, obviously I care equally as much about the other wines, but like when a Syrah turns out correctly, that makes everything worthwhile.
Well, so you mentioned that Matt Dees manages the Kimsey Vineyard, and it's in Ballard Canyon.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the vineyard specifically, and then how that sits in Ballard Canyon? I know known for sandy soils. I don't know if that applies over to Kimsey, but then also how you see that expressing itself in the Syrah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Kimsey Vineyard, a little bit of background. It's owned by Bill Kimsey. It was planted in 2008. It is in the southernmost section of Ballard Canyon. So if you're on the 246, you could basically hit a good drive from the hitching post up to Kimsey Vineyard. So Matt Dees loves to say that it's a climatically driven vineyard. The soils are clay loam. There's not a lot of sand. I actually just talked to Ruben about this today. They're kind of, I don't want to say boring. They kind of get the job done, but it definitely doesn't drive the style of the vineyard. The vineyard is really driven by the transverse Santa Rita Hills, blowing in that fog every morning. And we have a very moderate temperature and a very long growing season. So we get fog and coolness till about 1 or 2 o'clock. It burns off and it jumps up to 82, 84 degrees. And that's kind of it. That's kind of what happens there. And it just gets this beautiful moderation of climate to grow Rhone varieties. So we get the sun, we get the heat that we need, but it's moderated in a beautiful way. So, the ranch is CCOF, it's certified organic. It has been since its inception, and it only houses Rhone varieties. And Bill Kimsey has an eponymous label, but it's very small. I think they do maybe a couple hundred cases a year. And then the rest of the fruit is sold to local winemakers. The entire ranch is Rhone varieties. It's Syrah, Grenache, Viognier, Grenache Blanc, Roussanne, and Marsanne. And the lineup of wineries in that vineyard is very esteemed. I definitely get imposter syndrome driving through that vineyard at times. When I see my name on the post, I'm like, I don't understand why it's there, but I do my best. But yeah, this particular wine comes from Block 7, and Block 7 is a Massal selection of clones. So it's about 8 different clones. They're not exactly sure where they all are, but it gives a very, very good expression of Syrah in a very robust way. So what's cool about this particular block is you can really decide what kind of Syrah you want to make based on your pick decision. So I, in the last few years, have been out of that vineyard, the first one out by far, probably 2.5 weeks before anybody else. And that just came from this probably, my desire to move my craft along to make a different type of Syrah. So in 2016, 17, 18, 19, it was all destemmed, a little bit of new oak, a little bit more what you would consider a classic California Syrah. But to me, it got a little boring, and I wanted to make it a little bit more challenging, a little bit more earthy. I don't know. Basically, I just wanted to piss off more people when they tried this wine. So in the last few years, I've gone 100% whole cluster. I've always been indigenous yeast, but now I'm 100% whole cluster, large format, 500 liter punch-ons, open top fermenters. And in that photo a minute ago, you saw me foot treading. So that's pretty much the only way you can get it, punch it down or get a little bit of juice going when you do 100% whole cluster. So that's what I do. Fermentations are 2-3 weeks long, and then they're racked, pressed and racked to barrel. Like I said, large format mostly. I've come to learn that, you have to be really careful with new oak on Syrah. Syrah has inherently smokiness to it. And I think that, when you play around with new oak haphazardly, you can really start to get some extinguished campfire aromas going. So, yeah.
Well,
so, yeah.
I think that you don't need to have any imposter syndrome. This is really a beautiful expression of Syrah. It's got, the first thing that jumped out at me was like a potpourri of roses. I mean, I got really strong rose, and now I'm getting a lot of kind of eucalyptus and a little more herbal, but it's this beautiful balance between like the herbal and the floral.
Yeah. The first person I showed it to, her immediate reaction was, it just smells like you walked into a flower shop. And I'm like, yeah, that's a great. And then behind all that, and what's so cool, I think, about this wine is behind that you have hallmark Syrah aromas. So you got black olive Tepignon and meatiness and pepper and things like that. But it kind of lingers behind the earthiness and the greenness. But I use greenness in a fond way, not in a bell pepper way, but like a flower shop way. It's really pretty.
Yeah, it's really pretty. It's got really nice, these kind of, really chalky smooth tannins, and then this little tiny rush of brightness at the end, but that savory character comes through on the finish. So on that, because this is not a big strong Syrah, but it still has that savoriness, what would you pair with it?
Yeah, see, that's the thing. Like a lot of times you get the cliche answer, oh, I'd pair it with a big ribeye because it's Syrah, blah blah blah, it needs protein and stuff. This one is a very, very fruit-friendly wine across the spectrum. So I've even had this wine from start to finish in meals, and it performs very, very well. It just doesn't need to be tamped down on your palate. So it does really well with even lighter fare, like chicken and things like that, and pizza. But you could definitely still have it with your more generous or decadent steaks and things like that, for sure.
And I'm curious, if you were to pair your wine with music, song, musician, or style, what would it be?
Yeah, I don't know. I honestly, it's probably good. I'm just gonna say yacht rock, because that's always what's blaring when we're bottling. So I'm just gonna go with that. Some stupid cheesy Michael McDonald song would be perfect with this wine.
And what is the price on this wine?
$45.
$45.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I have a few questions, so I'm going to jump back. But one is, I know that Folded Hills and Margerum have tasting rooms. I know, Bob, your tasting room is up in the Slow Coast in Arroyo.
Yeah.
And you're moving to a new one in Arroyo Grande.
Right.
But Dusty, how can people taste your wines? Do you have a tasting room, or do you do appointment only? What do you do?
No, I'm kind of an inhospitable person, so I try to stay away from letting people taste. So I don't have a tasting room. It's just the winery in Camarillo. The wines are mailing list and allocation. This wine did not sell out on release. It's one of the few, it's Syrah, I don't know what to say, but it did not sell out on release. It's one of the few wines that don't. So it is still up on the website. I have about 7 or 8 cases left of this wine, but it is still available in the public store on the website. So yeah, but I do a lot of festivals. I enjoy that. It kind of keeps a barrier between me and the consumers, so I don't piss anybody off. So that works well for me. So if you're in the Southern California area or Santa Barbara area, this weekend, Saunters and Sips up in Santa Barbara, I'll be there.
And June 10th, you'll be at Vintage Hollywood.
I will, in Santa Monica. That's for sure.
That's right. Thank you. And I want to jump back in. These questions are going to be a little out of order, but there was a question about the Grenache. Michael, how long does it take to ferment?
It's a great question. So Grenache skins are pretty firm and pretty tough typically. And we do foot treading on the fermenters, but that year, 2020, I spent 20 days on the skins. And then at pressing, because those skins are tough, you get a little bit of residual sugar out, which continues to ferment for another 6 weeks or so. So 20 days on the skins for the primary fermentation while the skins are in contact with the juice. And then upon pressing, another 6 weeks or so to finish off in barrel.
Wow. Okay. And Robert, a question for you about Viognier is, and also I'll open this up to all of you. What do you think about skin contact Viognier? Tom Hill wants to know if that's a waste of a good grape or.
To each their own. There's a time and a place for everything, and all expressions of winemaking are valid. All types of enjoyment are valid. I honestly love a good skin contacted Viognier, but I'm not drinking it at the same time I'm drinking this lean, mean stainless steel Viognier. Both are valid, perfectly valid. I don't like rules when it comes to winemaking too much, Be yourself.
Bob, you have a thought on that? Michael, Dusty?
Well, skin contact wouldn't be traditional with Viognier. It's a pretty tannic white varietal, actually. So it could be a little bit, much, I think, but again, like Robert says, to each his own. There's a lot of wines that Gen Z is drinking these days that I think are just spoiled wines that they like. So who am I to say?
Yeah, I mean, for me, Allison, the technique is not for me, but I respect it, and there's certainly a place for it.
And would you say the technique's not for you for Viognier, or just not a technique that you employ with white wines generally?
I wouldn't go there with Viognier if I were to do a skin contact white. Just my preference. I would choose something with less tannins in the skin.
Here's another question for all of you, which is about the forecast for Rhone varieties in Santa Barbara County over the next 5 to 20 years, given the challenges of climate change. What are your thoughts? It's a kind of big question.
We're in the right place for it because of the climate that we have. We're in an area that's really best known for Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, but obviously the Rhone varietals, which ripen later, do well. And we have, this huge body of Pacific Ocean off our shore with these valleys that are open windows to the ocean. So yes, we're feeling the effects of climate change, but I think we'll feel it a little bit less than some other areas might.
Yeah, and I think you also have to, take into consideration how climate change is manifesting. So we don't exactly know what's going to happen. A lot of people just think, it's just going to get warmer. That's not necessarily true. We might just get more hectic events like we've had the last couple of years. When was it? September of last year, it was like 120 degrees in Happy Canyon. I mean, so just being nimble, being on our feet, and learning how to deal with these extreme weather conditions will help. But vines are really good at that. You don't get a plant that hangs around for 100, 120 years without seeing some dark days. I mean, they know how to regulate. They know how to survive. It's a very, very hardy plant. And I think we'll do well in the near future. I don't see it being a huge problem as long as we are able to respond to some of these dramatic events that happen.
Mm-hmm. especially like with all the rains we've had of late. Are we happy about that?
The vines are happy.
Yeah.
Vineyard infrastructure has suffered here and there, but to Bob's point, I mean, there's nothing that can leach the soils like that kind of rainfall.
Right.
Right. Another question that came in earlier, and this is, I think, generally is, what do you feel the effect of large corporations coming in and buying small family wineries in the Central Coast will be?
I'm not touching that one.
I'll start out that Dusty Neighbor Wines is for sale if anybody, if anybody's interested, but I don't really have much.
The better, right?
That's a challenging one. I mean, I think that, first of all, the only wineries that tend to get looked at to be purchased are the well-performing wineries. You don't see, I don't hear of people looking to acquire wineries that aren't high performers, but I think that that's definitely something that can be challenging for the local landscape of the county. And I think it's going to be important to just continue doing the best we can to make the best wines we can, and then we'll let the chips fall where they may.
Absolutely. I mean, in fairness, and as the comment was, that the question really is happening a lot more in Paso and North than it is in Santa Barbara County so far, but we'll hopefully not see that change too much. I don't know if there are any more questions coming in from the chat, or if you guys have any more comments you want to add about Santa Barbara County or Rhone varieties, or specific to your grapes.
But going back to Tom Hill's question for Robert earlier, how did Doug Margerum get into Rhone varietals?
Yeah,
It's because of his time at the Wine Cask and buying and selling Rhone varietals from wineries like Cupay and Ojai, and being kind of part of all that, you know, the early days of those wineries evolving. So he got very turned on, early on by Rhone varietals in Santa Barbara County.
Noted. I'm going to surprise him with that bit of knowledge.
There was one more question for you, Bob. It was coming about Marsanne. Do you think that the Marsannes you're currently making will age as well as the original 100% Marsannes?
Absolutely. Yeah. If not better. The vines are older, not that that's necessarily the be all and end all for aging, but no, I think they'll age just as well.
Great. Well, I want to thank you guys so much for joining us. We did it in exactly 1 hour. We're right on time. For those of you who were tasting along, I hope you enjoyed the wines. For those of you who weren't tasting along but listened in, these are definitely 4 wines we're seeking out, or any of the wines that these producers make. Really beautiful expressions of Rhone varieties. Really, it'll make you rethink Viognier. It'll make you rethink Syrah. If you love Grenache, you'll still stay in love. And Marsanne, you probably don't know a lot about, so this is one to check out. So thank you for joining us today for the Rhone Rangers experience with Santa Barbara wines. And thank you, Bob and Michael and Robert and Dusty and Craig and Larry and Kim and everyone who joined us.
Thanks, Allison.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.